My name is Rohit Chandra, and I am a fellow at the Center for Policy Research, and welcome to the second day of CPR Dialogues. We truly appreciate our morning warriors who show up at 9:30 a.m. for panels, so you've had your coffee, and we're going to assault you with plenty of knowledge and policy kind of thinking today. In these testing times, it's more important than ever to think about maintaining the long-term health of India's public institutions. And so today will be a deep dive into many of the critical policy areas, which will be instrumental in shaping India's future trajectory. Before we start, a couple of notes and requests. First of all, we would appreciate if you could keep your mobile phones off, or at the very least on silent throughout the day. We would also encourage you to share your thoughts and this event on social media using the hashtag CPR Dialogues 2020, if you so please. And we would love to amplify these conversations beyond the room. So this morning is going to be a blue skies conversation about the role of ideas in public policy. And to introduce kind of the first session, I'd like to invite our President, Yamini Iyer.
Thank you, Rohit, and thanks everyone for being here with us this morning. And I see many familiar faces who bravely stayed through with us yesterday as well, which I'm taking as a huge compliment. Thank you very much. It really, your support emboldens us. So we will be doing more of this thanks to your presence and all the support that you've given us over the last day or so. I also did just very quickly, before we launch into the day's proceedings, wanted to say a quick but very, very important word of thank you to all my colleagues at the Center for Policy Research. None of this would be possible without their support. Everyone has commented over the last day on how fresh CPR is looking and our new branding. All of that is in no small measure thanks to the work of our fantastic communications team led by Prerna Seth with Dhruv Bhasin and Varun Pandey, who really put their all into this exercise over the last 2 days. Supported in no small measure by Himali Sondi, who's a publicist and is consulting with us and has really pushed us to get fresher, to think more creatively, and to be more 21st century. So thanks to all of them. We owe them a lot. Without them, these 2 days would not have been possible. And it exceeds certainly my imagination of what conferences should look like. And they've now set the bar so high that I'm afraid they're going to be locked into having to be creative with us now for a very long time to come. Also, I did want to especially thank my colleagues at the Center for Policy Research, all of CPR faculty. Not only is their commitment to ideas, which we shall discuss through this morning's session, but their commitment to independence, their commitment to objectivity, their commitment to rigor is what makes CPR such a unique and special place, and what pushes me to be much better at what I do, and what pushes me to be far more rigorous and not take the shortcuts and the lazy routes. None of what we do at CPR would be possible without their passion, their commitment, and their independent intellectual spirit. But most importantly, thank you all for your willingness to humor me in every Mad Hatter idea I get. Your healthy skepticism ensures that I do things which are not completely crazy. Without your healthy skepticism, I think this would be even crazier. But without your support and your willingness to go along for the ride and your passion and participation, this would not be possible. So thanks everybody for making these 2 days so special and for keeping the CPR flag flying high. None of this would be possible without all of you. This is a collective endeavor and a collective enterprise. To the issues we wanted to discuss today, one of the reasons why we thought it was important to have this session is because a question that we consistently grapple with as a policy research institution, and one that we are confronted with very often in conversations with policymakers, with funders, with civil society, with the ecosystem that we engage with, has often been about the role of policy research in the policy making space. And for us at CPR, we very strongly believe that research is fundamentally about the role of ideas. Policy making is often thought of as the art of balancing trade-offs, and negotiating compromises. Sometimes it's almost taken for granted that the state of the world as it is needs to be worked through, designed, and implemented, rather than asking ourselves normative questions about the state of the world in and of itself. And in fact, policy making often gets confused as a process about the nuts and bolts and the design. The policies are right, it's the implementation that suffers. When in fact we need to ask ourselves, how do we get the policy right in the first place so that the implementation is effective? Ideas matter significantly to debating the underlying norms and underlying assumptions that determine the state of the world. And in fact, getting policy right is about challenging those ideas, engaging with those ideas, building those ideas, and confronting and challenging the state of the world as we understand it. And that's the role that we believe is very central to what a policy research think tank must do in this space of ideas, in the space of policy making. The other issue that we often get confronted with when we talk about policies, policy design, and policy implementation is the issue around how to get implementation right. A lot of what CPR does, in fact, many of the conversations we had yesterday were very much focused on this issue of how do you get implementation right. But again, underlying all of this is the question of the state of the world, which needs deeper engagement in order to ensure that the doing, many think tanks today now describe themselves as do tanks, but to get the doing right, you have to ensure that the ideas themselves are effectively engaged with, debated, and critiqued, which is what makes for a robust and rigorous policy ecosystem. This issue is even more important in the current context where public discourse and public debate has been reduced to very, very polarized opinions, to its own echo chambers, where critique and dissent is often taken as being on one side rather than the other, and where evidence, rigor, and robust public conversation has been reduced to a lot of shouting matches and relatively fewer safe spaces in which discussions and discourses of this nature can take place. The impact this has on policy making is actually far more significant than we have been willing to engage with, because policy making then inevitably is influenced by the broader public ecosystem in which policymakers exist and which policy making decisions take place. Therefore, engaging with ideas in today's context becomes even more central. And what we've hoped to do through these 2 days at the CPR dialogues is to go back to those first principles, is to go back to ideas and reassert the importance of critique, of debate, and of argumentation. And what we hope to do in this session is to be able to build an analytical framework in which we can engage with this, to put ideas in the front and center of the policy-making debate and in the front and center of what policy research institutions must do. To set us off, we had requested Professor Lant Pritchett, who's very well known for most of this audience as for his work on India in his days at the World Bank and later at the Kennedy School, and is now at the Blavatnik School working on a very important project on systems reform in elementary education, but is also, I'm proud to say, a visiting faculty at the Center for Policy Research, to talk us through some of the analytical principles of the role of ideas in framing public policy. Unfortunately, given the challenges of the day, it was difficult for him to fly across to Delhi, but we did request Lant to give us a short video, which would help frame the conversation, which we will play for you shortly. And following that, I've requested my colleagues Navroz Dubash and Partho Mukhopadhyay to be in conversation with me to engage with some of the issues that Lant lays out for us, but also talk through how we as researchers who've had a long engagement at the Center for Policy Research and with the policymaking community have engaged with ideas and our understanding of the relationship between ideas, public policy design, and public policy implementation. So to start with the video, but I'm quite incompetent at doing this, so Rohit, I might request you to just figure out what we need to do. Oh, someone else is doing this. Fantastic. Thank you.
Very sorry, I'm joining by video and not there live. I would love to be in India as always, and I'm especially sorry that I was not there and missed Mantak Ahluwalia's book launch, which is happening today, Thursday, I guess, as I am recording this. Mantak is, as many of us, a hero of mine. I would have loved to have been there for the book launch and loved to have been there, but have disastrously managed my life, and so I can't be there. But I do want to talk about ideas and how ideas, particularly generated by think tanks, matter. And I want to argue against two commonly and increasingly argued views against the idea that ideas matter. One, which I won't spend that much time in, is that only interests, and particularly monetary interests, matter, and ideas can never trump interests. The second is the idea, when we think about the mode and the level at which ideas matter, that it is the detailed engagement and policy design level at which ideas primarily matter, and hence at which academics or researchers or think tanks should be engaged. And I think this is exactly wrong. I think if we want ideas to matter, ideas have to matter first and most at the biggest possible level, and only by mattering at the biggest possible level can we then influence the course of events that will ultimately lead to program designs and implementation that will make a difference. And attempting to skip the stage and the idea that the micromechanics of what works is really the key constraint to making ideas matter, and performance, I think, is a popularly argued idea and is just completely wrong. And in part, the problem with wrong ideas is there's a Gresham's law, is that wrong ideas can drive out good ideas, and in particular, wrong ideas can drive out funding and support for right ideas. And so I'm very concerned that in the world today, there's too much time and attention given to details that can't possibly justify the expense and investment because they don't really make a difference, and too little time, attention, and resources devoted to the big ideas that frame the popular mind, the political debates, and ultimately can generate the purposes that will drive projects, designs, and implementation. So let me start from the idea that ideas matter. I think John Maynard Keynes is famous for saying that ideas in the long run matter much more than we think they do, and they matter whether they're right or wrong, and that people who think they're just common sense individuals and practical people of affairs are really slaves of a long dead scribbler. I obviously have a self-interest in being that. As a scribbler myself, I would love to imagine that when I'm long dead, I will have slaves, although they won't do me that much good. I think ultimately, though, this idea is right, that when you change the overall gestalt or the overall zeitgeist or the overall, some non-English, non-Hindi word for the general attitudes, you then have a cascading effect and change everything. And ideas matter most when they diffuse and become common sense. I know in my life, I'm now 60 years old, which is not that old, but it's old enough to remember when things were radically different. I was born in America in 1959, and we moved when I was a child from one part of the American West, Salt Lake City, to another part of the American West, Boise, that was about 6 hours of desert in between those two cities. And in 1968, when we first moved there, we drove back and forth to visit family several times a year, and we would stop at a fast food restaurant. we would eat our food and we would throw the trash out the window. And when I tell my children that we ever did that, they're shocked that I could have ever been such a cretin. But more to the point, I remember the day we stopped doing that, not the week. There was a particular public service ad that was part of the overall environmental movement and part of World Earth Day and the environmental movement in the 1970s. And there was a particularly poignant and moving commercial with an American Indian traveling through the woods and then trash at his feet. And I am tearing up remembering this commercial from when I was 10 years old. And boom, I think we just stopped littering that day. And generally within a year or at most 2 years, the norm of what one did with trash just completely changed. My father, of course, it took him at least a year before he would submit to the crying of his children that he couldn't possibly be such a cretin as to throw his trash out the window, in spite of his argument that it was just a big damn desert. Who cared if there was trash in it? But and on a more interesting and important level, race relations in the United States changed night and day since I was a child. And I don't think you can chalk this up to interests, either of those things. There were no powerful interests behind not littering. And in the end, African Americans have been at most 13% of the population of the United States. There's never been a powerful economic interest for civil rights. It was just the right thing to do, and the idea that it was the right thing to do diffused and became accepted, and became so accepted that basically in every conceivable legal way and every conceivable socially acceptable way, race relationships changed completely night and day from when I was born to today. So I just don't think there's any question that ideas can matter. Certainly in the details, interest can become powerful and can resist things, but I think big ideas can be very powerful and very immediate. But I want to talk a little bit about 4 ways in which ideas can matter. And I have in mind 3 ideas of scale and then 1 separate idea that isn't exactly scale but is interrelated with them. So I think there's 3 scales of ideas. One are sort of big ideas, themes, visions, kind of dreams, slogan that can be encapsulated in slogans almost. And if you look at nearly any movement that's been powerful and changed, it can almost always be encapsulated in a single sentence. You know, Martin Luther King gave a speech that I have a dream, and all you had to say was, I have a dream, and you encapsulated a huge amount. I, early in my career, was part of what I call the Hezbollah of free trade, and we had a slogan that, what did we want? We wanted free trade. When did we want it? We wanted it now. And kind of everything we said or did could be encapsulated around the idea that the world should be a freer place for goods and capital and people, although that has yet to happen. And I think at that level, one could just convince people that free trade was good, or that outward orientation was good, or more openness to the world was good. And that was an idea that then structured lots of other things. The second sort of level of ideas is classes, what I would call medium-sized ideas about interventions or actions or projects or programs that are the components whereby the big idea is realized. So one might have a big idea about poverty reduction, but within the ideas of poverty reduction, then one can, and particularly targeted programs to affect poverty reduction. But then within that would have class of programs. We could talk about microfinance as a class of interventions that would be aimed at project, or livelihoods programs as another class of projects that would affect poverty, or works programs like NREGA as classes of projects. And those are, and I say classes because those aren't in fact granular enough ideas that they actually represent anything other than an abstract idea. A livelihoods program, to turn it into an actual program or project that one could implement, one has to set dozens of design parameters. One has to say what kinds of livelihoods are promoting, how are we promoting them. I've written papers about comparing and contrasting different livelihoods programs, and even of 3 ongoing livelihoods programs, there were a dozen different parameters on which these 3 programs, all of which were easily incorporated within the class of livelihoods programs, differed. So I think evidence about that, again, creates scope for action. So, and it authorizes agents to get engaged and to sort of do things, usually under, again, the rubric of some larger idea. We're doing livelihoods programs because we feel that economic empowerment of these groups has been inhibited and they can be unleashed by livelihoods programs. Then the third level of detail is the actual design, what I call the design space. There's like, to do a conditional cash transfer or a livelihoods program or a macro program like an industrial policy program or even a program of, you know, a special economic zone within any actual concrete class of intervention has to be reduced to a series of very granular, very specific choices about the parameters or choices that determine the actual project. And those are very granular, and these are what actually get implemented. In the end, you don't implement a livelihoods program, you don't implement a generic livelihoods program, you implement a specific livelihoods program, or you don't implement a generic industrial policy, you implement a specific industrial policy. So, and then the fourth level, and then I'm gonna come back to kind of the idea that I think is wrong, is implementation. Now, implementation kind of is related to the design space, but it's not a separate level of idea. So I think there's a very popular idea now that what research by economists or others should consist of is the evaluation of, really detailed evaluation of super granular, super specific projects, which are, you know, elements of a design space of classes of projects, and that the point of that is to discover what works within a design space, and then the challenge of implementation is just telling the agents to do what researchers have discovered what works in the design space. And so I think this is an argument that ideas matter, but ideas matter by controlling and providing evidence of what works at the granular level. And I think this is just completely, totally wrong. It's almost exactly wrong. No, I think it's exactly wrong. The idea that we should do small, not big, ideas as a way of effectuating change is wrong for, I think, 2 fundamental reasons. First, I think in technical terms, the impulse response function, the efficacy of any given program, is often quite rugged over the relevant design space, meaning the program's going to work if it's designed this way and not work if it's designed that way, and that the design and efficacy of a given project with respect to context is just hugely variable. What that means is you're really searching over the Himalayas and not over a plateau. So discovering that something doesn't work or does work gives you almost no information about what might work in a different context or in a slightly different design. Within my space of education, we had a paper at a conference last year in which the RCT was done of one reading intervention in Uganda. When it was implemented in the first year, it had standard deviation impact, sort of massive impact, massive improvement in reading from implementing this project. Unfortunately, the project was far too expensive to be done at any scale in the way it was done that had the standard deviation impact. So they changed the project design as little as they possibly could, but still get costs down. And when they evaluated the slightly modified program, it had negative impacts. So again, it was like 10,000 feet high versus versus below sea level, all within a very narrow range. Now, if the design space is rugged, if the impulse response function or efficacy function or fitness function, whatever we want to call it, is rugged over the design space, the micromechanics of small research are just worthless. You can't generalize. You can't generalize across time. You can't generalize across space. You can't generalize across contexts. In which case, devoting large amounts of time and attention and genius, the opportunity cost of genius researchers to doing micro experiments is just completely wrong. Whereas if we step back and say, if we look at domains in which economists have been successful, it's often by creating the big idea and the medium idea, and then creating an environment in which the agents responsible for implementation are motivated to look for the appropriate design. So inflation targeting, again, by being 60 years old, I remember a world in which chronic inflation was a huge problem. There were, at any given time, 20 or 30 countries with inflation rates over 20%, and chronic inflation was very high, and sacrifice ratios of reducing inflation were very high, and it was a huge problem in the world in the 70s and 80s. Now, to the extent that that central bankers worry about inflation, they worry that the inflation rate is chronically too low, not too high, and part of that was creating a series of big and medium-sized ideas. The big idea was inflation really is costly and needs to be contained, and in order to contain it, we need to do something different than what we've done. And more specific ideas like inflation targeting. And inflation targeting was not a small idea. It was not, there was a handbook of inflation targeting. Inflation targeting was a medium idea, which is the central bank is going to have as its objective reducing inflation. It didn't specify the actual mechanics or the model of the world that the central bank would use in order to effectuate the instruments that it had at its disposal. It created a big idea, medium idea, and created an environment in which then the implementers went about implementing. So let me just conclude, because it was supposed to be 15 minutes and I'm a little bit over already, by saying I think the world has moved in some sense away from the idea that big ideas matter towards a world in which supposedly there's some scientific way that one can dig into the details and have those matter and replicate and be easily implementable. And I think that's just wrong, because in the end, for implementation to work, you actually have to convert people in the sense of they have to agree that they share your idea and purpose of what matters and how to do it. And the way you convert people is you don't convert people to the micromechanics of a specific design. You convert people to a big idea like protecting the environment. You convert them to a medium idea like not littering. And then you allow 1,000 flowers to bloom in terms of implementation. You convince them of a big idea like human beings are equal. You convince them of a set of medium ideas like law and social practice should allow for the equality of human beings across races. And then the micromechanics get worked out in the details of implementation. Not that the micromechanics start first, because coming back to implementation, if you don't have people convinced of the big idea and the medium idea, you'll never be able to successfully implement at the scale of the program. So I think ideas can matter, ideas can defeat interests, but they're never going to defeat interests at the level of the micromechanics of individual project designs. They're only going to triumph if think tanks and researchers and academics stick to creating and implement and stick to creating and articulating and providing evidence in favor of big and medium ideas that then can create environments in which the micromechanics of implementation can be handled. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Can I invite Navroz Dubash and Partho Mukhopadhyay to join me? Let me start with, I think, the big thing that Lant framed for us, which is the tensions between ideas and interests. And very often when we talk in conversations on policy making, the question, in fact, interests tend to dominate a lot of the debates. Why is it difficult to think afresh an idea, it's often because there are entrenched vested interests, political interests, the difficulties of negotiating compromises. And at least I find often in the minds of policymakers, interests tend to triumph over ideas. Navroz and Partho, what are your experiences on this, perceptions on this?
So let me give you two stories from one generic and one specific. I think Lant is right, but wrong at the same time, because the place where interests come into play is, in his scheme of things, the third level. So you have convinced people that the climate is important. You have convinced people the middle idea that you need to adopt public transport. And then the question comes around what kind of public transport. And it's quite possible, let's say, that a good way of getting around could be, for example, we did lovely work in CPR examining the auto rickshaws of Calcutta, which have an incredibly sophisticated network system. But the thrust of people will be towards building large metro rail systems. And we are now going to be building, as our finance minister, I believe, announced in this budget, about 50 cities is our target to build metro rails.
Yes.
I don't think we have public bus services in the cities yet. But we will build those metro rail systems because that's where the money is. 1 kilometer of metro rail is equal to 1,000 buses. And a metro rail contract is a much larger contract than a bus contract. And that's where interests, in some sense, come in. And they're harder because the narrative is that you are essentially supporting that big idea of climate change that Navroz has successfully convinced them is important. Right? So that's one level that it sort of works in. The second is the manner of politics. So way back in '98, before I joined CPR, I was involved in the Prime Minister's Task Force on Infrastructure and the building of the National Highway Development Program. And in those days, it was quite laughable to hear a Prime Minister talk about a national highway connecting Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Saurashtra to Silchar. And he imposed this cess on fuel. And there was pushback because a lot of farmers basically said that we don't use roads. Why should we be paying a tax on the diesel that we are buying to run our pumps? And what I think was brilliant about the response of Prime Minister Vajpayee at that time was, he didn't say, let's try and figure out a way to exempt the farmers from this. He said, you don't use roads, but you should. And today, as a result of that, he then essentially diverted half the cess money into building the rural roads program. He built the constituency for that cess by providing that benefit. And today we have over 600,000 kilometers of rural roads and a whole different perspective on urbanization that I now study. So it's the manner of how you approach these issues that if you believe in that big story, you then see that these are people who are being left out of that big story. How do I bring them into that broad narrative? Rather than, okay, let's focus on just getting it to these guys first and we'll talk about coming to them later. And that is where I think the core belief of high politics is.
Navroz, as you respond to this, can you also reflect on the role of the community who believes in the idea plays in negotiating these tensions between ideas and interests? I remember when we first met and you came to CPR, climate change was considered to be a peripheral thing for the softies who believe in the environment, and suddenly now it's part of hard diplomacy. So something about the idea moved, and there was a set of actors that shaped that. So if you could just reflect on that as well, along, of course, with the broader picture that Partha laid out.
No, absolutely. I think you're right. Yesterday's discussion that Ambassador Saran moderated, it was the most sort of charged and energized moment was actually a section on climate change, which illustrates your point. You know, I think Lant has set up the larger question quite nicely, and I broadly agree with this. I think we are making a mistake if we think that, in a sense, ideas and interests operate in two separate realms. So when you have a role in trying to reframe and shape ideas, then interests locate themselves in the context of that idea once the idea develops credibility. Let me just take an example from something that we've tried to do, not just us at CPR, but many other people in India, using the climate example. So as many of you know, the conversation around climate change in India for at least since the early 1990s has really been a diplomatic conversation about the North versus the South, who's responsible, who caused the problem, and what India should do as a result, with the conclusion being that India should really be defending space for our own energy needs, our own carbon use, and when the West finally gets around to changing their lifestyles, then maybe we'll think about things. And there's some merit in that argument, but it did lead to all kinds of perverse policy implications. So for example, there was a big program in India to promote compact fluorescent light bulbs, the generation of bulbs before LEDs, which is what we have now. And the argument put forward was, compact fluorescent light bulbs are more efficient than incandescent light bulbs, but we won't pay for it because really this should be paid for by the West. Now this is despite the fact that we had power shortages all across India at the time, and this would have actually reduced our power consumption while giving us more light with the same amount of power. But because we didn't cause the problem, we shouldn't do anything about this. Now, what has kind of changed that political calculus is this idea of co-benefits, which emerged in the National Action Plan on Climate Change. It emerged as a way of saying, we won't do anything at home, we'll just continue doing what we do for development reasons, but there may be some fringe benefits for climate change. So a group of us kind of turned that around and said, well, we should be actively seeking those co-benefits. So public transport suddenly becomes part of a climate debate because it will bring development co-benefits in terms of congestion in our cities. All kinds of issues that were outside the pale of a climate conversation became inside that frame, and interests could redefine themselves with respect to that. In fact, I'll confess that I've been banging on about co-benefits so long that it was my birthday recently, and our group gave me a birthday poster that says "Stay calm and co-benefit." So it's which I'm happy to show you if you come to my office. But that's an example of how reframing ideas actually changes the game entirely. I'll just make one more point that I think sort of takes further what Lant said. We tend to think that when you talk about policy, it tends to map most closely to the discipline of economics, which is all about shaping incentives. But actually, sociologists and political scientists also have an important role to play. And when you think about shaping incentives, you're shaping incentives within a given sort of framework of a game, as it were. And what sociologists and political scientists can bring to the table is they say, maybe we should be thinking about playing an entirely different game. You're rethinking the rules by which interests define themselves. And therefore, you get much higher level changes that are possible, but also you get changes where the compliance costs are much lower. So Lant's example of waste and throwing waste out of the window. Now, if you actually had to monitor people throwing waste out of the window in a desert, it's impossible. But once you internalize a behavioral change, it happens with low monitoring costs.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you go back to CPR's history as well, when it was first set up in the early 1970s, there were the slow beginnings of thinking about the approach that India was taking towards its economy. And if you look at much of the work that the center did over the 1980s, when most of us were in school and college, it's quite fascinating to look at the kinds of publications that were coming out, because a lot of, I think, thinking that was generating within CPR and actually across the research community was on how do we rethink the basic foundations, the basic fundamental principles of what the Indian economy should look like and what its future trajectory should be. And I think it was that came together to create some kind of public opinion consensus of what needs to be done at the moment of 1991 when the balance of payments crisis hit. So in some senses, building a community of thinking around core ideas. We can debate the rights and wrongs of ideas, but having the fodder on which to chew on to engage with those debates itself plays such a central role in shaping then the consensus which allows for implementation to actually happen. Which takes me to the other tension that I think Lant brings out, and that I find particularly when we work on the sort of design to implementation part of the policy cycle that we confront quite regularly. So there's the big ideas, the medium ideas, and the small ideas, and I think
And the bad ideas.
And the bad ideas. We'll come to the bad ideas, not to worry. But let's go with the framework of the good ideas, or the ideas that at least have something to debate about. And I think that over the last 2 decades or so, there seemed to at least have been some kind of consensus over a set of big ideas that were competing with each other. So just take the sort of the growth of the Indian economy, the competing between growth versus inclusion, between growth versus sustainability. There were sort of set contexts and frameworks in which those big ideas were being debated. And so the policy-making community then begins to start focusing on the small things. How do we actually get the implementation right? And we found very often in conversations with policymakers, and particularly at the cutting edge of implementation, that the focus is on problem solving. So don't tell me how to think about my problem. Tell me what I need to do to solution this problem. And I think that has also created a large body of, it sort of fed into what research is also providing for, which is if your fundamental community that you are doing research for is asking for solutions, then inevitably research will start focusing on that, which takes us to the micro, sometimes so granularly that we forget about the big picture. So how do we balance that tension? Because the micro is very critical to framing the ideas as well. If you don't understand what's happening on the ground, and if you don't engage ideas in empirical realities, you do tend to get lost in ivory towers that then get challenged in ways that I think across the globe today ideas are being challenged.
So I think, so this is something I feel quite strongly about, that the rush to provide a solution before you've actually established whether you're asking the question in a useful way can be very problematic. So yes, absolutely, it's not like you can sort of operate at the world of ideas and stop there. Ultimately, you have to move to implementation and so on and so forth. And I think that's why also it's useful to work in partnerships. I mean, there are different, sometimes we do it within CPR, sometimes we work with other organizations, and it's clearly complementary. But the first step has to be to explore whether you're framing the question correctly. So let's take the power sector as an example. The government in the last budget announced something called Aditya. Aditya was the scheme formerly known as Uday, which was the scheme formerly known as APDRP2, which was a scheme formerly known as APDRP1. They were all aimed at the same thing, solving the financial crisis of the distribution companies. And they all had the same underlying idea, which is that you will shake a stick at the discoms and you'll give them a one-time bailout and say, you better straighten up or else. And the or else turned out to be, or else we'll do the same thing again in 5 years, right? Now, so the underlying idea that the discoms were actually capable of managing the politics of the sector by themselves, and the incentives of the state governments were aligned to enable them to do that, was the underlying assumption behind all these programs. And so once again, without questioning that underlying assumption, we moved to implementation based on a flawed set of premises. And it's proved to be very, very costly. So a reframing of that, which we try to do in this book, Mapping Power, basically says you can't escape the fact that electricity is a fundamentally political sector in India. And therefore, you have to find a way of making a transition in the distribution sector in a way that also yields political benefits. You have to align the politics and the financial incentives. And you have to do that in a state-by-state way, as Lant described, in a very deeply context-specific way. What you'll do in Tamil Nadu is very different from what you'll do in Chhattisgarh, for example. So I think it's really important to say, yes, we don't want to be staying at 42,000 feet, but we have to start by asking the question, are we thinking about this problem appropriately? Are we understanding its complexities? And then move to thinking about what the solution space looks like.
So then let me ask you this. Are we as a community falling into the trap of being too quick to respond to what is being asked of us rather than trying to frame what should be asked of us? Partho?
Let me take off from APDRP1 was actually,
You designed it.
no, Montec did, I was actually in the room. But Montec wrote a paper in 1990 called the M document, which has been popular. And in the M document, on page 2, you have the SEBs are not paying NTPC, but there is something we need to do about this now. So it's been with us for 30 years, right? It's never been thought of as something that is stopping Make in India, right? We need our industrial enterprises pay some of the highest prices for power. And we wonder why our manufacturing sector does not grow. We have been looking under the labor regulations lamp for a very long time. But we have never really looked under, switched on this light, partly because,
There's no light.
Yes. So that framing is, I think, what is important. And that I think what's nice about CPR is precisely because of this ability to work across sectors instead of being in a particular silo. That helps us put some of these things through. And also because as economists, we take preference functions as given and then try and see what is best to be done under this. But as Navroz mentioned, other disciplines and politicians try to change the preference function, right? And that's what we are. So Swachh Bharat is a good example of an attempt to try and change a preference function. And it's done pretty well. Even the survey that the government chooses to dismiss shows enormous growth in both installation and usage. Not as much as the government claims it has, but still incredibly substantial. But again, what are the consequences of that kind of story? Right? So why did we want to do Swachh Bharat in the first place? It was not to ensure that everybody had a toilet. It was essentially that people needed to have better health. And the absence of a toilet was essentially somehow impacting. But if the fact that everybody has a toilet now leads to the fact that your water supply is going to be filled with E. coli bacteria, and then you end up everybody drinking contaminated water, that's going to essentially destroy the original reason why you did that particular story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is and therefore, colleagues building on, we worked on one of the things that we do at CPR is characterize urbanization as not moving people, but morphing places. Picking on that idea, colleagues in our group, which looks very deeply at sanitation, picked up the fact that people in India were actually building septic tanks and not these kinds of twin pits that the government was talking about. And consequently, what happened as a result is they now realize you need institutional solutions to deal with these kinds of investment by people, which has been completely ignored by the government so far. Now, government's waking up to it at various points in time and structures. Right? So it is at that level, as you rightly said, not so much, even within the smaller pieces, which questions do you want to frame?
Yeah.
that is quite important. If you, as long as you don't lose sight of what was your original goal in the first place, do not essentially change a target into an objective.
No, absolutely. In fact, a lot of what we'll be discussing in the session that comes after this on accountability initiatives work also comes from exactly that place, that at the, as we focus on implementation at the micro level, we lost sight of what is the right question to ask about why implementation fails. And through just being on the ground, we realized that in fact there is something very fundamental about how the state is structured and organized and where power rests that needed a lot more engaging with to be able to ensure that that last mile of accountability in the state is actually infused. And that's where a lot of the discussion that I think will follow this session will come from too. So I think what's particularly important about this conversation is that that there are tensions in the relationship between ideas and policy making. But as policy actors in our own way or contributors to the policy ecosystem, that engaging with those tensions and being able to step back and remind ourselves of the importance of asking the questions and framing the questions is fundamental, whether you're working on the big idea, the small idea, the medium idea, or you're actually engaging in the doing. Because if we step away from that and get lost in the doing, then our role as policy researchers will get conflated with what government should be doing. We shouldn't be substituting for government. We should be enabling and strengthening policy-making processes. I know there are probably lots and lots of questions, but we are all out of time. Can we maybe take two questions and a quick round of responses? Avni, just give us 5 minutes. We'll be quick. Jeff, and one question from that side.
We aim to be spatially inclusive, at least Yamini aims to be spatially inclusive.
Spatially and age and gender. This is going to get complicated.
For good reasons, I think you focused on Lant's first issue of interest versus ideas. But I would like to just ask what might be sound like a rhetorical question about his second critique, which is the use of, say, RCTs in generating interesting policy answers. So, for Partho, first, is exactly how often do policymakers refer to randomized control trials in designing sanitation and water supply separation, electricity grid expansion, transport systems, and land rights and expansion of cities, which is going to be necessary for growth of India. And for Navroz, I want to know exactly how much did the IPCC, is that right?
Yeah.
Or actually anybody interested in the existential problem of climate change rely on such things?
Is anyone at the back who'd like to ask a question? Okay. Anyone in the front who'd like to ask a question?
Hi, my name is Suraj Kumar. You talked about the role of ideas in shaping policy. Would you like to reflect a bit on the role of funding in shaping ideas?
We are firmly non-partisan and independent. We do what we want and hope the funding will come. But go ahead.
Let me take that one first. I think, fundamentally, it goes back to the question of incentives. Right? Can those incentives change our behavior? And it then depends on what our preferences are. How strong are those preferences? How deep are our beliefs? And I would like to believe that a lot of us in this space are in this space because we have those strong preferences and beliefs. And I think the whole idea of saying that funders are able to mold rhetoric, change stuff, is a little bit of a cheap shot and lets us off too easily. Sure, it's a hard convincing. Just the fact that we need to focus on ideas rather than implementation is hard convincing. Not doing RCTs is hard convincing, and somebody's in a variety of ways. But that's the conviction that we need to be able to convey. And if we aren't able to do that, then we aren't doing our job. Jeff, I'm going to duck that question. We'll duck that question because it is yet a wave that is cresting. And I think the Nobel this year gives it, hopefully not a tsunami-like kind of structure coming forward. My experience with policy making has been a bunch of relatively old males sitting around a round table, shooting the breeze, and in all good faith, and this I cannot emphasize more, in all good faith, with all good intention, coming to a decision that they think is in the best interest of the country. How each of them bring that conviction to the table, some of them might be influenced by RCTs. Right now, for example, good friends Sam and Paul using regression discontinuities have told us that our entire investment in the 600,000 kilometers of rural roads that I just spoke about must have been a waste, because they can't really see any difference at the discontinuous level. And I just fundamentally say, it's nice technique, it's wonderful aesthetics. I think as an economist, I find them incredibly seductive. But just like with Scylla and Charybdis, they're very seductive, they're sirens. I tend to try and navigate my way through that seduction.
Navroz, 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't think Lant's second point was about RCTs. I thought he was laying up this 4-part thing, which is incidental, surely, the RCTs.
He's ducking it even harder, right?
No, I won't talk about climate, but let me give you one example where there's a live experiment going on. My colleague Santosh is somewhere in the room here. On air quality, there is an RCT going on in Surat where they're trying to basically do a market-based system, and they're doing the whole sort of paraphernalia around that and finding quite successful outcomes. And the question is this going to become a story about replicating this approach for air quality, which would be very significant? The early signs seem to suggest that there is a lot of what Lant said, where a huge amount of investment and time and effort went into this. And it's also Gujarat, which is a more state with greater capabilities, and so on and so forth. But we have a natural experiment going on this, well, it's not so natural, on this point right now. So, watch that space. That story hasn't fully played out. On funding in shaping ideas, there is, I think it would be a mistake to think about the world of funding as being an entirely distinct world. I mean, these are all epistemic communities with sort of porosity across them. And so I think if you, our hope is that if you can establish yourself as being credible in that work, in that world of ideas, then the people who are your audience are also the funders, right? So actually the funders are also coming to us for engagement with ways of making their funding more creative. So I think we have to think about it as a conversation, as a porous space, rather than as distinct worlds where we are agents and they are principles.
Well, when you're thinking of micro-level actions that need to be done on the ground and you need to figure out A versus B, RCTs are useful. When you have the big questions that you need to ask and answer, you have to have a lot more, and multidisciplinary approaches and focusing on the big questions and the big ideas are, I think, important. I think all of these things have to intersect and interplay with one another. One only is never enough. And on that note, thank you very much, Navroz and Partho, for yet again indulging me in this conversation, and look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you. Sorry we went over time.